Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Aslam Bulbulya. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator at the SFU Center for Comparative Muslim Studies. Welcome to Universal University, ? On Space and Inclusion in Higher Education. We're very pleased to have Dr. Saladdin Ahmed joining us for this conversation that's been co-presented by the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies, the Center for Dialogue, and Scholars at Risk. Just before we get started, I'm going to invite you to do some Zoom housekeeping for yourself. There's two different options for Zoom on how you view the speakers on the screen. So in the top right-hand corner, you'll see a little view button, and you'll have the option of a gallery view or a speaker view. We recommend that you use the speaker view. It minimizes the amount of attention that you need to pay to multiple boxes on a screen and allows the speaker to have more of your attention. Also, feel free to keep your camera on or off, whatever is most comfortable for you. Having your camera off might also allow you to stretch, walk around, move around without too much distraction or disturbance. And yeah, if you have any technical difficulties, feel free to message IT help, Aretha Monroe, who's on standby to help you with any questions that you might have regarding the Zoom features or anything else that's happening today. Before we begin with the formal program, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So for those of you who aren't familiar, a land acknowledgement is part of the protocol of the indigenous people of this land. We begin by acknowledging the fact that we are on, in particular, stolen, unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh land. And as we talk about space, the idea and the question of land and land ownership and possession and dispossession is so central to this discussion. I am based on the land of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, not too far from a village called Sanuk, where people who were living in what is now Stanley Park, which was a village called Hoi Hoi, for many, many generations were displaced and moved to. And from Sanuk, they were displaced once again. And I come from South Africa, a land where my grandparents were forcibly removed from their community as well. And we know the impacts of this on communities, on lives for many, many generations into the future. We hope that this conversation is part of a journey of healing from the colonial impacts that have affected every single one of us in multiple ways, but starting at the scale of the university for today. If you are joining us from any different lands, feel free to introduce yourself and share the land that you're joining us from in the chat box at this time. I'd also like to introduce Tiare Zhang, who's joining us as a graphic recorder for this conversation. So Tiare will be taking graphic notes of the conversation as it goes on. We found this is a great way to get a living record of what conversation took place, in addition to the fact that this conversation, at least in plenary, will be recorded. Tiare will be taking some graphic notes that can be shared afterwards and give people a sense of what was said here today. Anything you want to add, Tiare?
Oh, yes. I am really honored to have been graphic recording for events that the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies has put on for the past few years. And I think that you're doing really incredible work in building solidarity. And I just wanted to say that the drawing is really meant to be for you and to resonate with the experiences that are shared here. And so as you can see, I've even made a spelling mistake in the title that I'm correcting right now. So if you have any feedback as we're drawing together, I do welcome that. So don't feel as if it's my art, because it's not, it's something we create together. Thank you. Oh, if you don't see me on the screen, I'm still fully present. I'm just moving around my space for my supplies. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so much. And if you'd like to see Tiare's work as it progresses, you can pin that screen as well. Just to let you know a little bit about the flow for today. So we're going to have a little bit of context setting from the director of the center, Dr. Azadeh Yamini Hamidani, followed by some solo reflection, and then we'll have the conversation between Azadeh and Dr. Saladdin Ahmed, followed by some breakout groups where as participants we'll be discussing some of the key questions that are emerging from the conversation, and then we'll have some time to reflect back and share back from our group conversations before hearing some closing remarks. So with that, I will hand over to Dr. Azadeh to share with us some context for the discussion today.
Hi, and thank you everyone for being here, for being present, and for joining us. So as Aslam mentioned, I'd like to provide a little bit of context for our conversation today. When we consider the etymology of the word university, we discover an interesting ambiguity. It derives from the late Latin universitas, which is defined as a body of people forming a society, company, community, guild, or corporation. Considering this root meaning, we are faced with a question: who exactly constitutes this body? Is it a community? Is it a company or a corporation? Despite the ambiguity, the word university also contains within it an ideal, the ideal of universality. That is, it should ideally be something that belongs to everyone. But what precisely do belonging and inclusion mean, especially when we consider our history? Let's take our own institution as an example, beginning with the name Simon Fraser. Simon Fraser, a fur trader, established a permanent settlement in British Columbia and the first trading post in the West. He was, in short, a colonial settler. And so SFU, named after this settler, lies on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and other Coast Salish nations, who were neither acknowledged nor consulted in the 1960s when SFU was built. From the very beginning, we are at a crossroads. On the one hand, we have an ideal of an institution meant to empower and enlighten. We want to believe that we are part of a noble project that will make the world a better place through knowledge and learning. And yet, the very space we inhabit is the result of a settler colonial project that eradicated, displaced, and caused unfathomable suffering to the local First Nations communities. Our ability to work in institutions of higher learning in North America is built on a history of exclusion of First Nations. Yet this is not the only dilemma we face. Public universities like ours depend on government funding and tuition. Despite these resources, the university also depends on contributions from donors to fund programs and buildings. Take, for instance, the Goldcore Center for the Arts, the building which houses so many of our most creative and critical programs was made possible through the contribution of Goldcore Inc., a gold production and mining company that has been repeatedly accused of exploitative labor practices, human rights abuses, and environmental pollution. Here we are presented with another dilemma. Can we take money from donors and wash our hands of what was committed to acquire it, because it is now being put to good use to fund educational projects? This in no way pertains to SFU alone, but is true of most universities. In fact, we are privileged not to be tied to a more sinister history. Dozens of American colleges and universities, for example, are in the process of investigating their own historic ties to the slave trade. In fact, profits from slavery helped fund some of the most prestigious schools in the Northeast, including Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, and Yale. While we contemplate how universities come into being, we must also look at how spaces at the university are regulated and monitored. Take, for instance, the incident involving a Black alumnus in the dining hall on the Burnaby campus on December 11th. The student was asked to leave the space, and when he refused, the RCMP was called. He was pepper sprayed, tasered in the head, restrained, and arrested. This incident leaves us with many questions. As a public institution, does the university constitute public property and by extension belong to the public? Do spaces at the university belong equally to everyone? And is our right to inhabit certain spaces not only unequal, but also predicated on inequality? So before we move on to our discussion with Dr. Saladdin Ahmed, we'd like to take a minute to learn about what inclusion means to you. So if you could just take a minute to think about it and post in the chat what inclusion means for you.
Thank you all for taking the time to share those, and please keep sending in your reflections as they come to you. There's so many wonderful contributions already, some of the tensions between inclusion and assimilation, justice, being able to show up, constantly engaging and adapting to meet the needs of different people as they come in. Definitely a topic that we're going to spend a good amount of time on today. With that, I'm going to invite Dr. Saladdin Ahmed and Azadeh into a conversation around Dr. Ahmed's work and how it might pertain to the university.
Thank you, Aslam. So to help us think through what space and inclusion mean at the university, we are joined by Dr. Saladdin Ahmed, who is the author of the book Totalitarian Space and the Destruction of Aura, which was published in 2019. He holds a PhD in philosophy, actually, from the University of Ottawa, and is currently visiting assistant professor of political science at Union College. In his work, Dr. Ahmed tackles contentious subjects around culture and racism, mass mentality and fascism, surveillance and totalitarian space, the Kurdish liberation movement in Iraqi Kurdistan, and the rise of the Islamic State. I would like to also take the opportunity to thank the Scholars at Risk program for introducing us to Dr. Ahmed. They do incredible work to support academic scholars who are themselves excluded and ostracized, robbed of spaces of self-reflection. Their work gives us all the opportunity to hear from scholars with valuable lived experience. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be posing questions to Dr. Ahmed, which will be followed by breakout sessions to discuss some of the most pressing issues pertaining to space at the university. So with that, I would like to invite Dr. Ahmed and the rest of us to think of these questions in light of the university as an institution and a space. Dr. Ahmed, welcome. We're delighted that you're here.
Thank you very much, Azada. Thank you, Aslam and Terry, and all those who contributed in any way in arranging, and Alice, of course, and Scholars at Risk, and your teams at SFU. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak to such a truly diverse people from different parts also of the world, especially I guess many of you are from SFU, Vancouver, BC area. I really appreciate it. Thanks. So sorry, Azad, I interrupted you. I think you were going to say something else.
Thank you for joining us, and let's dive in. Tell us a little bit about how you became interested in the concept of space and why it's something important to think about.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. It's a great question. I can't promise that I will be able to do justice to it. I mean, to be honest, I have, until you asked the question, I hadn't even thought about such a major and crucial question, why I became interested in space. Well, perhaps there are reasons for that also, but I'm just going to try roughly to give you an impression of why I became, of why I think I became interested in space. I mean, like all other, it seems to me, like all other research questions, there's of course, the subjective, the personal side of it. And I am, so without going too much into autobiographical information, which might be not interesting, but I come, just for the context, I come from a very old city in Mesopotamia, currently Iraq, northern Iraq, it's or Kurdistan for, of course, for Kurds. And I'm Kurdish. I come from Kirkuk. Kirkuk is that city that is very, very truly diverse, historically diverse. All kinds of people claim that city, and they are all right, except those who claim it to exclude others, of course, are wrong. And in my personal view is that if there is any hope in the Middle East or elsewhere, it is when we start defending people, groups of people to whom we don't, strictly speaking, belong in the traditional ways of classification, identification, and so on and so forth. So anyway, I come from that city, and as a minority, I grew up there. And as a minority, it was for me always, you know, space was something outside, and I felt myself as being kind of, allow me to say this, a spatial addition. And like, if you want more literary language, I would even like to say spatial wound, like an addition in like an event, an accident, a spatial accident. Much, much later, of course, I left Kirkuk under circumstances, maybe we don't need to go into very political. I was a political prisoner, I escaped, and that was it. I was not during Saddam Hussein's time. And I was never able to go back to Kirkuk. So Kirkuk just became kind of a legendary space for me, and a space for nostalgia, and a space for all kinds of, you know, issues that are both political but also subjective. Okay, so
you come
to
from a
me,
very yeah, you come from a very rich history and background of a city that belonged to many people, and you yourself felt.
Exactly, the city is extremely rich historically. There was a big population of Jews, for example, for literally hundreds of years. They lived there. For example, there was a neighborhood, they still call it the Jewish neighborhood. And to me as a child, it was always a question, this is the Jewish neighborhood, where are the Jews? And of course, one of the stories people don't know about the Middle East, outside the Middle East, or even some Middle Easterners, is that like Baghdad is, you could argue, is the most ancient Jewish city, just as it is also a city for others. But there was a big population of Jews there. They were persecuted. They were deprived of their homes and histories and so on. But there are also Armenians, Kildanis, Assyrians, Turkmens, Arabs, and Kurds, as I mentioned. Okay, but then
so from this very rich history that you find yourself in, what were you experiencing that led you to write about totalitarian space?
Okay, great. So to me, as I was saying, then space was, I was in space, I felt, but never part of it. So I would, if I generalize it, I would say it is the feeling of being a refugee, a spatial refugee. And I will just come to your question after one more note. Much later, after multiple experiences of exile and so on, I went back to reading Bachelard and Gustav Bachelard, and there are very few thinkers who really took space seriously, and Bachelard is one of them. And Bachelard is a philosopher of science, but then all of a sudden he surprised even his own colleagues and friends by writing a great book called The Poetics. The translation would be The Poetics of Space. In that book, his definition, if I paraphrase it, for home is, it is a space in which you are able to daydream. It's the space that allows you to daydream. So and here's my answer then. I always felt that I am not able to forget about myself, my bodily presence, to the degree of allowing daydreaming, you know. And it's a great privilege to be able to daydream, right? And I'm pretty sure that the minority members, of course, I use this expression, minority member or minorities, in terms of power distribution, not in terms of number. For example, women, I'm sure a lot of women have experienced, like refugees, like racial minorities, have experienced that feeling that there's a moment you tell yourself, what am I going to do with my body here right now, under all these gazes, right? So that feeling of othering and otherness, that led me to then eventually to totalitarian space, but that's a longer journey. I don't want to take more time. I hope in the next step I will come back to that point. What is the relationship then between that and totalitarian space?
So how do you define totalitarian space? What are some of its features?
Okay, to me, the most significant feature of totalitarian space is sameness, repetition, a flatness, the elimination of uniqueness, the elimination of individuality in that sense of uniqueness. Totalitarian space is is a flat space on which every strange body, whether human body or otherwise, is easily recognizable, detectable, and therefore eliminatable, let's say, by relations of power or by the dominant. So to me, I will just say one more thing and then stop here for you to comment. To me, then, the way I use the word totalitarianism, there's all totalitarianism that is based, as Herbert Marcuse, for example, argued long time ago, is based on force, on terror, right? But that, I argue also, that kind of totalitarianism failed miserably. The totalitarianism of fascists. Of course, fascists invented the system in that very strict sense, or Mussolini, to be more precise for now. But I think that failed miserably. More perfect form of totalitarianism is the system that relies on hegemony as opposed to physical control. It turns us to beings, to citizens, to creatures who freely give up our freedom. Or even worse, take ourselves for free beings, free citizens, without being free. We might sense something is wrong spatially, historically, and so on, socially, but we can't even name it. And that's why I think spatial literacy is crucial, is terribly important, and it's terribly lacking. We just don't have spatial literacy. I hope I'll have time later, if there is time, to expand also a little bit on that.
On the issue of space, could you explain to us how space determines the ways in which individuals are included or excluded?
I think, strictly speaking, spatial regimes might do that, which are always, of course, part of other social and political regimes, or say even regimes of truth in that sense. But space itself doesn't do anything. It is we who create space, we use space, we use it sometimes passively, a very bad, terrible thing, of course, sometimes creatively, actively, and therefore change it. So space is something always in the making, and the actors are the users of space, the humans who use it. So I think, so there's an argument, there's a movement out there that, writes about the importance, for example, of art in public space and whatnot, and what should we do. I am sorry to say this, but I strongly disagree with that direction. I think all the great artworks of the world cannot turn a space to free space without the users of the space themselves gaining that awareness. And let's remember, fascism was never short of works of art. So I think it is what Lefebvre, a very important French philosopher, I'm sure Azada, you know of him, Henry Lefebvre, wrote about space, and his famous book, The Production of Space. So there, remember, his first element there, his first very important concept is spatial practice, or one of the very important early concepts there. So it's the spatial practice is an extremely important element in the production of space.
So can you tell us a little bit about how we as individuals, either knowingly or unknowingly inhabit space that can be exclusive or inclusive?
Okay, great question. Here's the thing, the challenge here is that because of the lack of, allow me to say this, the lack of spatial education, spatial literacy in general, it is very complicated. All these questions are complicated. They can't be summarized and really simplified. I'm sure you agree. And just to make the case, I would say the following. Like I will make an analogy, a very basic, simple one. When we talk about history, we are aware of the fact that history by itself, it's not something out there. It can be personified. It is actually our own practices collectively, individually, intersubjectively, and so on and so forth. Space functions on that level, in other words, in terms of the agency, of our own agency, in a similar way. So we could be excluded, we could have the feeling of inclusion, but these are not qualities. They are states that change, situations that continually change. And that's exactly why I'm also against that kind of, the ideas of inclusion in terms of, say, cultures, because culture is already kind of objectified and turned to a dead identity, and it is actually a form of estrangement, therefore. So unless we understand, I will go back to Lefebvre to make the following claim, one sentence. Unless we understand space dialectically, it is all useless, really, to think and try to understand how we could have space of inclusion or space of diversity and so on and so forth. I know that's a very strong statement, but
what do you mean by dialectically? Could you explain what you mean by understanding space?
Yeah, so my emphasis exactly was on dialectics. So dialectical, space is dialectical in the sense of its production, and because it is production, Lefebvre says it's a product and production. So it's a process. It's a process we are continually always involved in, whether we know it or not. Now, another important, just a premise, let's say, that's worth reminding ourselves of is the following. We are fundamentally spatial beings. All our acts are spatial, including our dreams, including stuff we call spirituality. These are all spatial. They couldn't be otherwise. And as such, we need to understand how space itself is produced through our own acts. So most of the time, we are not aware of our involvement in the production of space. So dialectical in that sense, it's continually changing. And I'm, as a human being, I'm always a participant in that change, in that production. But the difference is whether I'm doing it with the awareness of emancipation, of freedom, of egalitarianism, and so on, or without those awarenesses. And it seems to me that without those very important awarenesses, then we become passive participants, and by being passive, or by virtue of being passive users of space, we perpetuate totalitarian space, spaces of oppression, spaces of domination, and so on and so forth.
I really like how your analysis puts the emphasis on the individual and to the fact that it is an evolving space that we're involved in. I'm also really drawn to the way in which you define space, not only in our physicality of being in space, but also spaces of the imagination, of possibility. In your book, you talk about the danger of words like inclusion and diversity being instrumentalized. Can you give us a sense of how that happens? What are the danger signs of these terms becoming hollowed out, becoming instrumentalized?
Okay, great question. Thank you very much for bringing up all these great points and giving me the opportunity to comment on these. So again, I will start from some stronger claims, including the following. When totalitarianism reaches the stage of perfection in terms of space, among other things, it actually allows and even encourages, I argue, it encourages inclusion and diversity. These are good things. Especially when they become so marketable, why not? It is the stupidest forms of totalitarians. And by that, I mean, for example, all forms of fascism. They were exclusionary, they were intentionally exclusionary, and it was part of their slogans, and of course they are still around, and they immediately would other the other, right? So I would immediately feel, okay, I'm not home. The only possibility for me to go on as an othered other is struggle, is political struggle. And I have to create another space. There's no question around. That's why we have great works of art by people who opposed fascism under fascism, right? Now, so then let's make the jump. What is the problem with all this? Well, it is a exclusion through inclusion. Now, to break up that argument, we need time. So I won't even try, but I will just throw around few concepts that I've been working on lately in terms of this problem.
Or maybe just an example that makes it more tangible.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I will give you an example. I just didn't want to upset anyone. So I started to give a little bit of theoretical justification. An example, I would say the picture of 3-4 students who are compelled to make this fake smile, superficial, for the picture on the main page of universities, the brown, the black, the yellow, the white, and so on, just so that we tell the world we are a diverse university, and they all do that. Companies do that, capitalists do that, others do that, now even in the people outside the West have learned this little capitalist game of marketability and so on. That's an example, I think, of exclusion through inclusion. Why? Because remember I said my emphasis is on dialectics. What is the opposite of dialectical thinking? Identitarian thinking, as some people in the Frankfurt School, for example, argued. But also this starts, of course, with Marx. What is identitarian thinking? And it's not this thing we use it today, like identitarian in terms of, culture and so on. No. Just in general, identitarian thinking is that one-dimensional form of thinking that sees the world as entities, as if they never change, right? Say whatever, the Asian is just an Asian, forever an Asian, and who knows what that means. And of course, it just in today's world of othering through cultural racism and so on, it is completely reduced to a bunch of stupid images, right? Every other, not just the Asian, the African, the Asian, the Muslim, and so on and so forth, right? So that is the result, and it's not just by chance that you have identitarian also in that meaning. The subjective, so what do I mean before that? A true space of diversity, of inclusivity, must first recognize subjectivity, personhood of the other. Now that personhood is a space of change, of conflict, of thoughts, right? It's right. Any human being, by virtue of human being, has on many levels a crisis of that identity. Remember the old ancient Greek philosophy about who am I? This, seeking truth in that sense, and so. Well, that is all of us, right? But unfortunately, the European racist mindset, not all the European mindset, but the racist European mindset, so only the European as that being that is entitled of personhood. So for a long time it was, here's the model for human emancipation, and then it shifted. No, you leave that alone, leave universalism alone. Now let's talk about cultures and how they're all relatively whatever important, equal, and so on. So it is, in my view, it is another form of Eurocentrism, unfortunately internalized and globalized. But that's the example for me. It is exclusion precisely. Okay, you would say, what's wrong with the picture, right? What is wrong with the picture is that bringing one African American to the picture really means absolutely nothing. If anything, it means a lot of terrible things for the African Americans at large. Because what are we trying to tell the world? Is this one student with the smile, the representative, the ambassador of the continent of Africa and maybe in some ways America as well? No, it doesn't work like that. And by visualizing identity in that sense, we turn it to a commodity and we exile the subject, the human being, the suffering of the human being. A true form of inclusivity would recognize the body of the other. And as a person, as a space of subjectivity and personhood and so on. So yeah, I don't think I did a good job explaining the image problem, but I'm always happy to come back to that. In fact, it is one of my favorite examples, even in my classes.
No, I think we've all seen that image and come across it. Before we break out into our breakout groups, could you tell us what it is we can do to ensure that inclusion and diversity are meaningful and not tokenistic?
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Explained in your example. So how can we ensure that there is substantive change rather than just mere window dressing our problems?
Exactly. So my first suggestion would be dropping the terminology and replacing them by actual, I would say, more meaningful terminologies like anti-racism and anti-sexism. Because why do we even talk about diversity and inclusivity if we don't have a problem of racism and sexism and so on, right? And it seems to me, terming them diversity and inclusivity, we just turn them to something, again, positive, peaceful, nice, but it covers the problem. The problem is anti-racism and anti-sexism and so on, and all forms of domination, social, political domination. And unless we address those issues, And that takes, of course, continual political engagement and struggle and solidarity with the underprivileged. You know, talking about diversity in those senses are not going to change much. You know, like exhibiting flags of different countries is not going to do anything to make a space more inclusive. In fact, I think it turns those spaces to even more spaces of estrangement, like violent spaces in those terms I was talking about, for example, in terms of daydreaming, in terms of subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and so on and so forth. So my first suggestion would be talking more courageously and honestly about the problems which are racism, and therefore the struggle would be anti-racism, or sexism, therefore anti-sexism. That would be, and then we can talk about how to do that. It's all, but I mean, by all means, it's a very legitimate question.
I think that's a great moment to break out into our breakout rooms and to have a discussion, and we'll come back after about 15 minutes.
Great. Thank you. Should I also join one group? Is there a designated group I can, or should I?
Yeah, I think it's randomized. So you will be just put into a group.
Thanks, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to ask someone from each of the groups to give a quick report back on what was discussed in their group. And perhaps I'll just ask Renee to share the screen of the Jamboard, so we've got the notes to look at as we share back. So someone from group 1. Azadeh, do you want to share back?
Oh, I think I was muted the entire time. Sorry about that. I was speaking to myself. So we had really great contributions in our group, and I'd like to open the floor to the speakers. Adil, would you like to start us off?
I'm not gonna lie, I can't start us off because I have a little baby in
hand. Okay.
But yeah, do you mind if I relinquish?
No. Anyone else in the group want to jump in? Okay, so I'll if no one wants to take over. We had some feedback And one of the group members said that she's taken aback when she's asked where she's from, and she considers herself Canadian. She was born in Hong Kong, and then she's asked again, no, but where are you really from? And she shared with us that that's always something that takes her back a little bit. We had one group member who has experience working for a nonprofit and working with students with intellectual disabilities. And she noticed in her work that there's many assumptions that are made, and that, you know, once there's this experience that once educators are asked to modify something that they do, that there's this pushback, and that there's this sense that no one's really thought about being around someone in their class who has this label of having an intellectual disability, so that there is this lack of understanding and engagement on their part. From an educator himself, we had the feedback that racial and identity-based inequities at the university are present, and that there is a certain danger of assuming that the status quo is inclusion, or that there are certain prototype students, and that anyone who does not fit can feel like they don't belong. So that, again, this notion that this is an ongoing work, this is an ongoing struggle of creating a space of inclusion, that this is not just something that that comes without saying, and that there is an uphill battle really in dealing with issues of inclusion. We had another group member who talked about the prototype of inclusion being very white-centered, and that there's a certain danger of holding on to the illusion of democracy and inclusion as the status quo. So it was a very rich discussion, and I'm very grateful to all the group members who spoke out. Dr. Ahmed, would you like to respond to some of the points that were made?
Thank you, Azad. I think those are great points. The only thing I just want to quickly relate that, or link that to one of the questions we were dealing with. It was one main question, but then the discussion kind of turned it to multiple questions. And if I were to rephrase one of those subject matters, I would say, in form of a question, would be, can we talk about, even in theory, in principle, of a capitalist space that is inclusive? And unfortunately, my answer is no to that question. Capitalist space, no matter what you do to it, how we decorize it, we do, you know, the language and so on, of course, there are differences. And personally, of course, I prefer, don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those. I do think still capitalism is more progressive than, you know, say feudalism and everything that came before, to use the typical traditional Marxist classification of history, with all its problems. I acknowledge that. But can we have a capitalist space, or space and a capitalism that is actually inclusive? I don't think so. And that is one part that perhaps we didn't have enough time to talk about. If I were to do this very briefly, I think nobody is actually at home in these spaces of governmentality, spaces of administration. These are, to my mind, spaces of university spaces are designed by specialists who are part of the dominant class. Again, to use very broad terms, but you know what I mean, right? A space that is, like, for example, a space that is not alienating, that's not totalitarian, is a space that reflects the use value of the space. Therefore, it reflects the body movements and so on and so forth. And that makes it also aesthetically very different, very beautiful. We don't have that beautiful space. We can't even think about it because we only know these kinds of spaces. So I think the problem then is, of course, it's harder for underprivileged, but I don't think anyone is quite at home in any of these spaces produced according to the capitalist modes of production, to use that very strict language. I know a little bit abstract, but that's what I mean. So let's not reduce capitalism to just one problem or just money or capital in that basic sense and so on. So I think the problem is really much bigger. It is about dehumanizing the human, commodifying the human, and humanizing the commodity.
Thanks very much. I think in the interest of time, we'll just move through each of the group's feedback relatively quickly, and then we'll have Dr. Ahmed respond to all of it for a little bit. So I was in group 2, and we're asking how university spaces reinforce unequal power relations and what can be done to change this. And really, I think the idea of spatial literacy that Dr. Ahmed was talking about came up. The fact that we don't often realize how space is being produced and reproduced through practice. Some examples were given of new spaces where there's pre-existing understandings of how that space should be used. That doesn't change according to the usage patterns that are needed. There's certain rules about the space, not having graffiti. And within the university, unequal power relations kind of being maintained through tone policing in lecture halls, this assumption of being nice, to call things anti-racist, to call out, white supremacy where it exists, to show up with any form of anger is seen as, not the way the space should be used, and then people are policed and pushed aside in those ways. And then also a strong discussion about securitization and capitalization that comes with that, the ways that through privatization of space, we don't have the housing, transport, accessibility needs of students prioritized. And when there is some sort of consultation process that takes place, the mandate is set by those who are in power, and there's a facade of choice being presented to those who don't inhabit power positions. You get to choose one of 3 options instead of being one who decides what those 3 options are from the very beginning. Okay, thanks. We'll move on to group 3 if there's someone from that group who wants to speak back.
Thank you.
Elodie.
Thank you, Aslam. We had the privilege to have Dr. Ahmed in our group, and we were discussing that question of how capitalism determines spaces of inclusion or exclusion and what can be done to change it. I think one of the first reflections from the participants was this is a very overwhelming question, and there are many ways to approach it. And understanding that capitalism, as Dr. Ahmed just said, also underscores other forms of oppression, and that each of them can be tackled in different ways. But in terms of space, we also had the privilege to have an architect in our group discussing how spaces, physical spaces, are created and how sometimes they also reflect those systems, the hierarchies, the demands of different groups. But one thing that did come up at the end of our conversation, and unfortunately we were so deep in this rich conversation we didn't get to finish that discussion, was the idea that universities are also spaces for contestation, and the bodies of students oftentimes occupy their own spaces, especially when they have demands that they make on the institution or how they approach certain injustices. And SFU does have a rich history of contestation among student bodies. So again, thinking about the space we occupy and what it was designed for and how it may be subverted by those bodies occupying it, I think speaks a lot to what Dr. Ahmed was sharing with us earlier. I'll leave it at that. Is there anybody else in the group who'd like to chime in?
Thanks, Elodie. In group number 4, Nav, are you okay to give some feedback?
Hi there, yeah. So group 4, Elena's going to present some feedback. And our question was how do universities act as gatekeepers to opportunity? Thanks, Elena.
All right, hello, I'm Elena. Yeah, so I think in a nutshell, when we see how do universities act as gatekeepers to opportunity, this idea of expectations and reality kind of seems to summarize for me what we gathered from this question. And so the expectations part of it reflects, we're starting to talk at the beginning, how like the work expected from a student in classes versus the reality of the situation is all these clubs and opportunities and programs and events are so enlightening and really look awesome, like these events, for example. And yet that balance of being able to be a student, but also be a learner and actually go through these opportunities there seems to be some tension. And another thing that was brought up is the expectation of what it means to be a student in a university. And it seems like we're being pigeonholed or narrowed into a specific window of what is a student. Can it be an individual with disabilities? Can it be a mother with children? And I guess all these other identities and roles that come into play as people, they're not necessarily reflective as like life outside of university. And for me, it was a big question of like, is this university life really encompassed in the actual world outside of university after being in school for so long? And there's all these different, Christina brought up this Western education model where the students' time, the time, I guess, is seen as quite different. Everyone seems to think of time differently. Everyone spends their time differently. And so how do we kind of in university allow for that time and allow for that space of everyone to bring into your university context? And with that, again, reinforcing this idea of a lack of compassion and I guess really holding that space for other people in this context. And I think, unless anyone wants to chime in, is what we talked about as a whole.
Thanks, Elena. Prad, in your group? Leah is speaking from group 5.
Yeah, so I'll be just reporting on group 5's question, how can we begin to imagine spaces of resistance and equality? And so some of the first sort of insights that came out of our group were from Elaine, who researches poverty in universities and single mothers specifically, and then Hanadi, who spoke about university in her home country, Syria, or I guess former home country. I don't know how you characterize your home. I'm sorry for assuming there. But that it was free in Syria, and here university costs so much money. So this intersection of what it means to have money here being really important, which is an interesting connection to these previous discussions about capitalism. Someone in our group mentioned that having a seat at the table doesn't truly equate to having a voice at the table. And so a lot of things that we do really are giving people maybe seats at the table, but not actually letting them be heard. And the discussion in our group with this question starting with spaces of resistance was really so fundamentally different from what we saw in the chat responses that opened this whole session, which were a lot more like nice things that someone could include in, you know, a marketing brochure, you know, openness and access and stuff like that. But if we say, how do we resist, we're going to talk more about meaningful interventions. And if we talk even more further about like how do we dismantle white supremacy, how do we combat, capitalist emphases in the university, we're going to be having much stronger interventions. So that's sort of an attempt to sum up in a minute what we did in 15. And thanks, Elaine, for sharing more about your specific research there.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you, Elaine, as well. And finally, from the group number 6, Alice.
Hi, thank you. We had a mixed group, which was interesting. Our question was, what advice would you give administrators to make SFU more inclusive? And our group actually did have a blend of SFU students and administrators, so that was very interesting. So I want to share what was brought forward by folks who are part of the SFU student experience. One was the experience of applying to SFU, and that the suggestion is that the folks in the admissions office should not have access to anything that may be identifiable. They should only have access to credentials, things like letters of intent or transcripts, etc., to ensure that we aren't excluding or discriminating against folks based on identifiable information or potentially identifiable information. As well, another person experienced, I thought, what would be a good example of exclusion by inclusion, which was applying to SFU as an international student. So international folks are encouraged to apply to attend SFU, but then are required to pay more in tuition. So I thought that was a wonderful example of what it feels like to be included or excluded by way of inclusion. So the experience of a student at SFU, what you receive would be the same, however, they had to pay quite a bit more. And that exclusion didn't stop once they actually moved to Canada, by being excluded from workforce because not having PR, et cetera. So this inclusion exclusion piece, I can now start to really see it through examples. Some of the comments that were brought forward by administrators included, included things like having to fill out forms, forms being something that are quite challenging. So when you have to enter something into the space for gender, for example, it's not open enough, or having to award, give out awards, for example, we're not allowed to take a holistic approach. So there's very strict parameters in some of the policies that we're asked to perform within. As well, looking for more training to reach folks on the importance and the impact of diversity and equity and inclusiveness. We talked about, as administrators, we need to really understand and acknowledge the position of power that we sit in, and then exercise that within, where we can and when we can, to push back against these policies and not just to accept them uncritically. Of course, we talked about, we need to keep talking about this. We have to open up spaces to allow folks to share what their experiences are so that we can really take that in, understand it, and make changes. Of course, the notion that inclusion should not be a slogan, which sometimes we do rest upon, which I think is exactly what you were mentioning in terms of Dr. Ahmed, in terms of having inclusivity in the imagery that we put out, or flying many flags. And if there's anything that I missed, I encourage anyone from Group 6 to pop in or pipe in now or add it to the chat. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll invite people to add that to the chat. Dr. Ahmed, if you can reflect back on perhaps some of what was shared. We don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to say if people do need to leave, feel free to do so, and this is being recorded so we can share the recording out. But perhaps if you can just reflect back on some of what you heard, and maybe with a focus on how we can begin to imagine spaces of resistance as kind of like a way forward and a vision forward.
Okay, thank you, Aslam. Thank you, Alice, also to bringing back those points from the earlier conversation. The spaces of resistance is one of the things also I try to think about and work on a lot in terms of at least conceptualization. I think part of our emancipation is the emancipation of our imagination. Our imagination is limited by the spatial and historical social conditions we live in. So unless we start a process, a project, a struggle for emancipation, for human emancipation, for equality, we can't reach a point of producing a model for free space or space of resistance. Within that struggle, I think our spatial practices immediately engage in the dialectical process of the production of space of resistance. For example, think about a city square, where it was just a city square, it became just a space of consumption and so on and so forth. But all of a sudden, within a political movement, it changed. It completely changed. It becomes, for example, Tahrir Square in Cairo, or what happened during the Occupy movement, if you remember. So it is the practice that immediately changed the function and the appearance of that space. And this is applicable also to, I think, to universities with more of these kind of conversations, literacy, questioning, problematization, and so on. We start a movement of kind of emancipation and resistance, I think. And it should be that way, and it should include the administration as opposed to policies from the administration. I think, which is one of the points that can be in a good conversation with what Alice and her group was saying. But thank you. I don't want to keep people more than that, but I'm really happy to stay longer and listen to you. I spoke, I think, already.
Thank you very much. We can ask Thierry just to give us an overview, a little bit about what has been heard today before we move into some final closing and thanks.
Hello. So I just wanted to highlight a couple things. Here, I think that it's really important to share some of the stories, and that's all part of taking on courageous honesty. And so I actually want to appreciate and thank you, Dr. Saladdin Ahmed, for sharing some of the personal aspects of your story, because I think that's so meaningful in letting people know where you're coming from and like, okay, where's this person? What's your context? So it really struck me, the statement that you made about, I was in spaces, but I never felt I was a part of it. And then the history of colonial settler spaces that create that dynamic for people stripped of institutional power or designated as other. And so this image here is meant to speak to that. Here we have the prototype white male academic scholar, some sort of institutional building crushing the landscape and the trees. And then this character is meant to be an indigenous person, and then here a Black person, sort of showing the relationship of the history of universities, not just in Canada, but also in the US. And so I think that that was valuable, weaving some of those stories of different totalitarian spaces where hegemony is a more effective than physical force, and uniqueness is detectable and eliminatable. And so here, this image that is taking place here around courageous honesty, I was kind of inspired by a metaphor that I've seen used by a lot of Indigenous land defenders of the snake eating its own tail. And like, that's an image that I come to associate with capitalism, with sexism, with racism. And so I'll be filling in more of your comments of just like really directly looking at, honestly, the issues. And I always try to tell the story of our conversations in a way where, you know, we're asking these questions around, what did you say? The emancipation of imagination. And so I love that you said like, freedom would be space for daydreaming. And so I imagine here in this corner, like a question around like, what do you imagine? Like we are all in so many ways familiar with these issues that we don't want to reproduce. So I hope in this section of the poster here, maybe it's an illustration of, you know, some of the examples given were students with disabilities and international students, students of various genders. Yeah, like a group of a variety of students, like, you know, interacting with the land in an intentional way. I don't know, but I think that the next, I love that invitation in naming these issues is also to like reclaim our imaginations, and that there's power in that. So thank you so much for inviting me to witness and reflect on what all of you have brought today.
Thank you for your listening and your capturing, Terry. Azadeh, final words?
I just want to really thank everyone for taking the time to be here and for sharing your stories. As you can see, we've really just scratched the surface, and I really hope that we can have more conversations and more of these events. Dr. Saladdin Ahmed, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us and your story. I'd like to close today with some hopeful thoughts. For the first time in SFU's history, we have a woman serving as president. And as we've learned over the past few months, our president, Dr. Joy Johnson, is committed to fostering an environment at the university where equity, diversity, and inclusion can thrive. We know that these ideals cannot be achieved by anyone alone, but that each of us bear responsibility in making it a reality. So let's hope that the challenges we've all faced in the past year create in us both the imagination and the will to create a better world. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Azadeh and Aslam and everyone, Terry, for that wonderful, very artistic summary. You made me feel that what I do actually has more value than I think. So that's very nice. Thank you, everyone, Alice, Aslam, everyone, and all the people who attended and stayed so long. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say on that comment, like we're here to lift each other up. I am so excited to put your comment, Dr. Ahmed, about we must defend groups of people to whom we don't strictly belong, and then we can all belong.
How nice when you stated it. It sounds very meaningful. I truly, I honestly think that is something that actually defines our politics more so than any kind of strict identity, any form of classification, and so on and so forth. And with that, I feel a lot of solidarity, and I am in solidarity with what you are doing and yourselves. And I do strongly also believe what you were saying about the Aboriginals, and I do think, without romanticizing, because that's also terrible, and that's not what you didn't romanticize, but I think it's a good example to look for those margins, at those margins, to learn about forms of resistance and struggle and emancipating ourselves. So really great to be here. Thank you very much. I want take more of your time.
Thank you, everyone.
And have a good evening, everyone.